Hey everybody, this is Dr. Chris Doss. Thanks so much for joining me today on my page, Biblical Languages and Literature. Before we get started, I want to let you know about some of the exciting course offerings in biblical languages and literature that are being offered through Sabra Global Education, like the Book of Isaiah from Yesterday to Today, which is an ongoing weekly course with Rabbi Dr. Robert Harris of the Jewish Theological Seminary, as well as my own course, How to Read the Bible, Tools for Studying the Jewish and Christian Scriptures. This is an 8-session class that meets 1 hour per week, in which I teach tools and methods for studying the Jewish and Christian Scriptures, including history, culture, and yes, even a bit of language. We look at just the basic elements of Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. And don't worry if you're intimidated by languages, we just deal with the elements so that the student can start to use more sophisticated print and electronic resources for studying the Bible. This course meets live from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, May 10th through June 28th, but it's okay if you can't make the live sessions, as each class is always recorded and uploaded to an online classroom. So be sure to register today. And if these courses might interest a group at your local church, synagogue, or learning group, Sabra offers significant group discounts. Contact info@sabraedu.com to find out more. All right, let's get to our video.
Now, despite the fact that we have different groups within the Jewish world, and this again is setting the stage for speaking about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament, at least the Gospels, we have sort of what scholars have started to call a common Judaism, which means that there are certain things that they all agree on, okay? And these are the three main things. Now, the three main things are the God of Israel, the Torah, which is the commandments, its study, and its interpretation. And then the temple, the one temple that we have in Jerusalem. Now, all these things are agreed upon in terms of that they should exist. How they are defined, in particular, Torah and temple, is different per group. So, for instance, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you know by now that one of the things that they believe is that the Jerusalem priesthood had become corrupt. So they decide to step away from the larger the priesthood of Jerusalem, and they make their way out to the desert. Now, this is not an anti-temple position. This is actually a pro-temple, anti-leadership position. And that nuance between the two is important because we have Dead Sea Scrolls that speak about God rebuilding the temple and then giving it back to this community so they can properly administer all of its rights, because they're the ones who have the true understanding. Okay, Torah as well. There's a conversation among academics, which academics can talk all day, about what Torah is, whether it's the first 5 books of the Bible and its interpretation. We find among the Dead Sea Scrolls that we're probably talking a little bit about both. That they believe that the Torah is given to them for them to follow, but at the same time, the interpretation of how to follow, okay, is important for each community. The same thing's going to be true when we get into the Gospels. All of this stuff sort of filters right into the Gospels, okay? Jesus himself has an interesting relationship to the temple, okay? So these are the three things we speak about common Judaism. When you put these three things in any particular group, it changes sometimes dramatically, and sometimes it's nuanced even within groups, right? So when you think of the groups, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, the Dead Sea Scroll community, we should assume that if they're in existence for 150 years, let's say, that there's going to be evolution in that group. Within that group, even later rabbinic literature says that within each group, there are 40 or so groups, right? So as the groups become bigger, they all start developing their own approach, right? Which basically means that each group that we're talking about has some internal diversity. Within the Dead Sea Scrolls, within the Pharisees, within the Sadducees, there seems to be some internal intramural diversity of thought in terms of these various things. So the broad parallels that we have are three. One, we have a literary setting that is similar. In other words, the Gospels are not being written at a time that is very distant from the writing of from the writing of the Dead Sea Scrolls, whether they be the community scrolls or whether they be the scrolls that tell us about the world or whether they be the biblical scrolls. All of Dead Sea Scrolls are on a similar plane with the writing of the Gospels with regard to their literary nature. That is, the writing, the composing, the style of literature that is being used, the motifs that are being used, the ideas that are being used, they all sort of fit together. And that is probably because, in particular with the Gospels, despite the fact that the Gospels as we know them are written a little bit later, past the first century, they're using sources, likely using sources from an earlier period. We have a similar social, religious, and cultural setting. And like Jesus with the Pharisees and other groups, we have criticism, debate with other Jewish groups. Now, a little bit more specific, although this is not incredibly specific, but sort of drawing in a little bit to narrow what we're looking at, some of the parallels that we have. And parallels are one of those sneaky things where you can notice a parallel, but the most important part is what value do you place on that parallel for understanding what you're examining. Biblical interpretation, apocalyptic literature, group formation, messianism, and ritual purity are a handful of the things, specific things that we have parallel between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament. This doesn't mean that they're only in the Dead Sea Scrolls and New Testament, but it means that there's significant parallels with regard to shedding some light on the New Testament, trying to understand what's going on in specific texts. So, for instance, I put here, I'm giving you that biblical interpretation involves the fulfillment style, or what's called the Pesharim. The Pesharim are a text that is unique to the Dead Sea Scroll community, and in it, they take a prophetic text, Habakkuk, Isaiah, any of the great prophets, and what they're going to do is understand, or at least they're going to interpret the prophet as speaking to their current period. In other words, if Isaiah is written 700 years before there's anybody copying or writing a Dead Sea Scroll, they are going to say, well, Isaiah spoke 700 years ago, but what he was really prophesying about was what we're currently going through. Okay. So the Pesharim, which means the interpretations in Hebrew, they're gonna quote a biblical prophet and then say, this means this. And on every occasion, they are interpreting the prophet through their contemporary circumstances. This happens throughout, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. This happens so that this would be fulfilled, and then it quotes the prophecy. Okay, that's a very close parallel between both the New Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Apocalyptic literature, the community at some point becomes apocalyptic. We, of course, have the book of Revelation and the last chapters of Daniel in the Bible. And then these other ones are just to sort of give you an idea of what parallels we have. What I want to do is touch on a couple of points regarding John the Baptist and Jesus to sort of give you an idea of what we're talking about. Now, the first one is John the Baptist. John the Baptist is interesting because of how little we know about him. Okay. Our largest narrative of John the Baptist is in the Gospel of Luke, where we get to know his mother, his father, and we get to know a little bit about him. But outside of that, we don't really know a lot about John the Baptist, apart from the baptism of Jesus. We do get in the Gospels that he is preaching or talking or teaching against Herod Antipas, who was the governor of the Galilee at the time, the tetrarch of the Galilee, Herod the Great's son. We do know that he's in the wilderness. And we do know that on several occasions, there's a question about whether he is the expected prophet Elijah, who in first century speculation was thought to be returning at some point. Okay. In the late 1800s, before the Dead Sea Scrolls are found, okay, before we know there's a Dead Sea Scroll, scholars are already suggesting that John the Baptist was in a scene. Once the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered and they start being deciphered, and we get the first hypothesis that the Dead Sea sect community and the Essenes are the same community, well, you can imagine that John then transitions over to being a member of the Dead Sea Scroll community, or at least that argument begins. Now, if you go to Khirbet Qumran, which is where you go to visit the site of Khirbet Qumran, they show you a video, and John's place among the Dead Sea community has been enshrined for all to see. Now, I will tell you that any relationship between John the Baptist and the Qumran community is difficult to determine. And we have certain pieces of evidence. But again, once you have the evidence, there's a question about interpretation. So let's deal with the first two things that people will say about John the Baptist. The first connection they usually draw is the fact that both communities use Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 3, to describe something about their movement. Here you have Matthew 3. I didn't give you all of them, but it appears actually in all four Gospels. This is Matthew 3:3. For this is he who was spoken. I highlighted the most important part, the voice of one crying in the wilderness. This is how John the Baptist is discussed. This individual comes in the wilderness preparing a way for the Lord. The Dead Sea Scrolls, particular the communal scroll, what's called the communal rule, and I've highlighted here as well the most important part, to sort of not read the text, is in the wilderness prepare the way for the Lord.